I use splines a lot in my joints. You may call it lazy, but they are crazy strong joints that you can make relatively quickly. But if you're going to make spline joints, you need a lot of thin cut material to make the splines. In the past, making a thin piece of wood was a hassle. You either ran the strip of wood with the blade nearly touching the fence, or spent a good amount of time measuring each edge to the blade, which makes multiple cuts very difficult. I found a few videos where the problem seemed to be solved as woodworkers placed the edge of their pre-cut boards against either bolts or bearings. And while I'm certainly not going to go after their ingenuity, due to accuracy and my own human error, I'd prefer not to wedge my spline making material against a fence in a jig. We'll start by measuring our miter slot. I find it safer and easier to cut partially into a piece of wood, flipping it over and partially cutting again, each time shutting off the table saw. I finished by using a pole saw to cut it to length. The best way I've found to find the center is by connecting my diagonals with a pencil. With the drill press, I drilled and used a fluted countersink bit. Then hit the bandsaw to cut about 3/4 of the way in to make an expansion bar that'll lock this into the miter slot. On the bolt that'll go into the expansion bar, I clamped it to my vise and cut into the bolt with a hacksaw. You know those drill bit sets that claim to give you hundreds of bits in each package? Most of the ones I buy seem to have most of those numbers in these 3/16 inch sizes, which makes a perfect size to keep our bolt from spinning in the expansion slot. With a little 5-minute epoxy, I glued it in and let it cure. These little drill bits might not be great at drilling, but they're hardened and are perfect for what I want to do with it. I cut the tip so that it better fit and tested the fit in the bolt. Perfect. Now we'll make the body of this jig by using a crosscut sled. This will give us a slot that our bolt will pass into. Both sides will measure at 3 7/8 by 3/4 of an inch. The center pieces are about 3/8 of an inch wide. I clamped it and gave it a few hours to dry before marking the holes for an old 2-inch broad butt hinge. If you're going to use a hinge, make sure it doesn't have any play in it. It needs to be solid without a removable pin. I use pilot holes before attaching the hinge to my jig. The other half of this jig will hinge on the first half. I marked where absolute zero lay, marked and cut it to size before adding pilot holes and screwing it to the first half. The idea is to be able to hinge the joint away from the table while I rip a board through. And because I don't want to manually lift the flap each time, I'm installing a couple of springs to do it for me. These springs are 5/8 inch in diameter and fit a hole I cut with a 5/8 inch Forstner bit. They fit so well that I didn't need any epoxy when I was done. Because this jig needs to be square perpendicularly to the miter slot, I'm making a body for it to fit into. This idea I'm showing you was a failure in the end. It was difficult to get the miter slot to line up just right and was just overly complicated. I'm showing you this just to give you a little background into some of the thought that went into this jig. It didn't fit very well and was not perpendicular to the miter slot. So let's rewind and start the jig body over again, and we'll make it a little less complicated. Instead, we'll lay the expansion bar under the jig, which meant I needed to cut another piece of wood that would stretch long enough across the miter slot. I repeated the process from before, keeping my bolt that I had already made. I added a couple walls on the sides and added some glue. I didn't clamp it down and just let it dry in that position. If you're wondering whether or not the expansion was affected by gluing both sides, it wasn't at all. When I felt it had dried well enough, I added a third wall that fit perfectly between the others, just adding a small amount of glue to the top half of the wood. This was to keep any glue from ending up on my table saw. I knew that the glue wouldn't be enough and screwed the expansion bar to the bottom using pilot holes and a countersink bit to prevent splitting. I used a steel ruler as a measuring gauge by cutting off about 1 1/8 inches. I made this my widest length, as ripping anything more than 1 inch on my table saw is considered safe practice without this jig. To attach it, I drilled a couple holes out using my vise, using a center punch to find the center, a couple pilot holes and 2 screws, and I was good to go. I once again found absolute zero with my blade before using a chisel to mark where my zero would be on the jig. So let's try this out. Because the walls were a bit tall on my prototype, I used fender washers before attaching my cheap plastic knob. When we use this, we'll butt up a board to the edge, lock the fence in place, and slide out our board, allowing the jig to spring up. This prevents any bumps or thickness problems with our wood to not be transferred into the jig itself. With a caliper, you can see that I'm just slightly off my intended 1/2 inch thickness. This jig also sits flush to the table, allowing much shorter pieces to easily be ripped. This jig worked pretty well, but I knew I could make it better. Let me show you how I improved it. I didn't want to cut all the pieces out again to make the jig body, so I instead drilled out the bolt slot and filed the corners down. I substitute the metal hinge with box joint hinges. I made teeth to go into the hinges out of potic and ebony. I didn't like the thickness of the last jig and chose a much smaller profile. Instead of 2 springs, I stuck with just 1. 2 worked, but it required a little too much to push down. This feels a lot more balanced. I chose to miter the jig box with the layered wood I made out of sweet maple and potic. To give it some strength, I snuck in some ebony splines. Instead of using wood glue to attach the expansion bar, I used a little hot glue before screwing it to the base. Instead of leaving a dent in the surface with a chisel, I chose to use ebony and carve out the shape of a triangle. I didn't like drilling holes in my last measuring gauge and chose to use epoxy instead. I ditched the plastic store knob for one I made. Overall, did the final model outperform my prototype? Probably not a whole lot, but if I need to buy a loaf of bread at the local box store, I'd rather drive a Corvette over a pickup truck. Hold on! Before you go, give my buddy Dirk at Sumo's Projects a glance. He's promoted my channel numerous times and has a great channel packed full of DIY projects and tool reviews. I'll have his channel on screen now where you can click on his channel. Please throw us a like and a subscribe, and remember to keep making things.